We appreciate having you all here today. I don't know if you remember, there was a commercial on television not too long ago. The setting was this military command center, and there was a 4-star general there, and a technician comes rushing in. There's an emergency. Security has been breached. And a technician says, "Sir, we need your password to stop this security breach. We need it right now." And the general hesitates. He doesn't want to share his password. The technician presses, "Sir, we need it right now. The breach is getting serious. We need your password." And so reluctantly, the general spells out his password. IHATMYJOB1. And the technician says, "Your password is I hate my job 1?" Have you ever felt that way about your job? Have you ever said that to yourself, now or before? Like, I hate my job. Maybe you worked at a company. Maybe it was your own company and you're still not sure you like the job. Maybe your job was being a mom or a dad or a family member. And you're like, "I'm not sure I like this job either. Whose idea was it to have these kids? I'm not sure." Maybe you work for a volunteer organization, maybe even a church serving, and you're like, "I don't really like it here." We've been working through a series called Why Bother? We're looking at real life challenges, real life problems. In church, everything sounds nice and rosy, and God is here, and Jesus is arisen, but in the plane of life, where real hard things come, what happens to your faith? Does faith matter in that world? Why do we keep trying? Why even bother to keep at it? We've been looking at this ancient book called Ecclesiastes that, according to tradition, was written perhaps, or at least the origins of it were some 3,000 years ago, purportedly written by King Solomon himself, who had like the best job ever. He was like king of this very successful kingdom. He had everything he could ever want. It's shocking to us to find then that he also hates his job. Look at what he says in Ecclesiastes chapter 2, verse 17. "So I hated life, because the work that is done under the sun was grievous to me. All of it is meaningless, chasing after the wind." This work, it's hard. It's working among the thorns. You get hurt. It's grievous. It's painful. So even someone with as great a gig as king of God's people, sometimes even he hated his job. This whole idea of working among the thorns, it comes from the early beginnings of the world's story. The book of beginnings, we call it Genesis. It tells us what happened. People rebelled, and God looked at the people and he said, "From now on, you're going to have to work among the thorns." Their job was to tend this beautiful garden, and he says, because of this brokenness, you recognize that you're going to have to work among thorns and briars now. It's by the sweat of your brow you're going to have to produce. And then you're going to die and go back to dust. You work all your life, you pour out your life, and then you die. And later on, we added pay taxes. That's part of the process. What a rosy picture. You work hard all your life, you pay taxes, and you die. And what God is saying, that's the curse of what happens because of brokenness. It's an important thing to remember in the context of work that we hate. That the reason why it's so hard and burdensome and painful is because we live in a broken world. We're broken, the people we work with are broken, the systems that those people have created are broken, and we're called upon to work in that brokenness. Which means that in order to survive in that context, we're going to have grace. Grace is an essential component in work. Otherwise, we get to that place where there is no meaning, there is no possibilities. All it is broken people trying to get broken stuff done and getting nowhere. We can get to that space. Even Solomon got to that space, which means that somewhere there has to be something else involved here, or we will give up on our work. It's just not worth it. There has to be some element of grace in here to really keep going on those days where we want to give up and give in, when we're asking, why bother? And one of the major problems at our work is other people. You ever notice that people are the cause of our grief sometimes? And I know you have never done that because you're Christian people, but every once in a while you've looked at the people you work with and you said, I think I'm working among fools. These are foolish people. Oddly enough, the teacher feels the same way. Look at verse 18. I hated all the things I had toiled for under the sun, because I must leave them to one who comes after me. And who knows whether that person will be wise or foolish. Yet they will have control over all the fruit of my toil, into which I have poured my effort and skill under the sun. This too is meaningless. All the work that we do, on one level, yes, we're working for ourselves because we're trying to get paid or try to produce something. It's for us. But we realize that our work is always for the benefit of someone else. We're trying to work for someone, either our employer, the owner, because they're paying us to do it, or we're working for the customer. We want to please the customer. We're working for them. Or we're working for our family, right? We want to provide for our family. We want them to be pleased with what we do. We have to take care of them. We're always working for other people, and something happens sometimes when we work for other people. This, again, I'm sure this has never happened to you, but you begin to feel that maybe they don't appreciate it. Maybe they don't appreciate it. Maybe they don't understand how fortunate they are. And you worry. You worry about that. You feel that. You experience that. One of my first jobs was, I was a waiter at a coffee shop in a country club, and you experience this firsthand as a young man. Some people get it. They appreciate what you do. They tip and they are nice. Other people, not so much. You don't feel appreciated. Same level of service. But that level of appreciation, in fact, in this current generation, in this current work culture, more and more companies have to invest in their HR departments into finding ways to make employees feel appreciated, because more and more it's becoming an important component to job satisfaction. People want to feel like their efforts matter. And it's going to take grace to work in this world where sometimes we don't appreciate. We're not sure that this is a good idea, that these people don't appreciate what they've been given. Somewhere along the line, we established a rule that says when we die, we got to give our kids stuff. Like, I'm not sure who invented that rule, but somewhere along the line, we invented this expectation that when we die, we got to leave stuff to our kids. And I'm not saying or blaming anything, parent, but you may have wondered from time to time, like, do my kids really appreciate what I'm doing here? Are they going to take good care of what is entrusted to them? Some of you decided no, so you just bought the bumper sticker, I'm spending my kids' inheritance. You just figured we'll just do that now. There's always this sense of, does the world really appreciate? It's a reminder to us, again, that grace is required to work in this world, in this broken world. It's required on two levels. On one level, it's a reminder to us to be gracious, to make sure that we are showing people they are appreciated. It's one of our jobs to, when we recognize that people are out there and they're putting their heart and line and their blood and their sweat, they're out there just working. Would it hurt us to spend some time sharing grace with them and say, we appreciate what you're doing. I really appreciate that. Thanks for doing that. Show that. It doesn't hurt us, and it really helps people get along and really experience what they're doing. That's part of the work of God, is to share that grace and help people to not go to this place like, oh man, does anybody appreciate what I'm doing here? But it will also require grace, because there are going to be people in our lives who are not going to appreciate. They're never going to appreciate. And then what do you do with those people in your life? Do they continue to bother you and bug you and keep it up night? No, there has to be a place where you give grace to yourself. You give grace to them and say, look, I don't get it, but I'm going to love you anyway. I get it that you might not get it, but I appreciate you even though you don't appreciate me, because you're made in the image of God. There's that challenge that comes when we get into that broken life of fools. And here's the reality. You're thinking they're the fool. I'm just saying they may be thinking you're the fool. And in that reality, how are these people going to get together and work together? It's going to be grace that says, well, maybe I don't understand their situation. Maybe they don't understand my situation. But it will happen. Life will break. It'll fall apart. In Solomon's case, he was exactly correct. Those that came after him did mess up everything. The kingdom split. It started to go downhill. Centuries later, both kingdoms were destroyed. Solomon got it right. He knows that there are fools in this world. That's just the reality. But to live and work among fools is going to require grace. Sharing it, receiving it, continuing among it. But as we share grace with one another, it's important that we also show grace with ourselves. Because sometimes in this broken world, we get to the end of ourselves, and not only are we working among thorns and working among fools, we're working under a lot of stress. Even Solomon felt it. Look at what he says in verse 22. What do people get for all the toil and anxious striving with which they labor under the sun? All their days their work is grief and pain. At night their minds do not rest. This too is meaningless. You know when you're experiencing stress, when you feel that grief and pain from work, you know because you are up at night and you're worried and you're stressed out. You know you've had those conversations, right, where you're talking to your boss or you're talking to your employer or you're talking to your coworker or your kids, and you got that conversation going in your head. It just goes over and over again. You're preparing that strongly worded memo that they're going to receive, right? We've all been there. That's stress, because what's happening at night and what's happening in those moments is we're not feeling up for the job. It's too big for us. We're not sure we can handle the situation. We're not sure that we have the words or the strength or the strategy or the ability to really affect the change. And so we're stressed out. We feel unprepared for this. That working under stress, it continues to eat away at us physically, even affecting our health. I was reading a couple articles this week on stress in the workplace, and interestingly enough, since the pandemic, there's been an increase in people quitting in the first year of their job. First year of their job, they're like, yeah, not for me. Since the pandemic, like 20% increase in people quitting year one. They just have had enough. In the UK and the US, just people walking away. And of course, you remember it was all during pandemic where we had this thing called the Great Resignation. Do you remember that? It's like everybody was quitting. Like all of a sudden we went into this crisis in our life and people were just walking away for a job. We had these thing called quiet quitters. They were just leaving their job. They weren't even telling anybody. They just weren't showing up. People had had enough. The stress of the job where it was just destroying their lives. They were like, I'm enough. I'm out of here. They just hated their work. It was just too much. They were staying up at night, and it wasn't worth it to them anymore. And that worked for a while until the bills kept coming. And eventually you got to work again. So now, we used to have quiet quitters. In the post-pandemic world, we have these other things called grumpy stayers. It's actually a thing being discussed in HR circles, grumpy stayers. They're people who are still going to work, but they don't want to be there. It's too stressful. They don't feel appreciated. They hate it. They're bringing down business because they're grumpy stayers. It wears out a person. Somewhere in all this, there has to be that grace that says, you know what, I'm okay. Even if I'm not up to the challenge, I can only do what I can do. Most of you know I spent years in corporate before I came into ministry, and I kind of had a mantra that I repeated to myself when I felt stressed, when I felt like it was all beyond me. I kept reminding myself that the best I can do is make good decisions and have good conversations. That's it. That's the most I could do at any time. Just make good decisions and have good conversations. Be as formed as I can be. Make as best decision I can. Sometimes it'll be right. Sometimes I'll get it wrong. But that's all I can do at any given moment is make good decisions and have good conversations. So I focused on that. When I felt overwhelmed and I felt stressed, I'm like, okay, this is all I can do. But there's a certain amount of grace required to get to that place where you don't feel like you have to fulfill everybody's expectation, because sometimes the job is too big. That was certainly true in my corporate life, and let me just tell you, as a pastor, the job is always too big. It's always too big. We're never going to make everybody happy all the time. It's just impossible to do. It's always too big. Now, having said that, I want you to tell you I'm not one of those job haters. I love my job. This is the best job ever. When you work for Rosa Church, like, it's an awesome job. People sometimes ask me, when are you going to retire? I'm like, I am. This is it. Like, I had a job. Now I just enjoy what I do. And you don't want me like playing golf or doing gardening. That's not going to go well either way. This is what I do. I love it. But even then, it's too big. And sometimes we have to come back within ourselves and say the best I can do is make good decisions and have good conversations, give myself some grace and realize I have my limits when I'm working under stress. But still, somehow, there has to be another step. How do we know that this all matters? That grace when we are working among the thorns, grace when we are working among fools, grace that we were working under stress. How does that all come together? How are we sure that that will work? There's one more element here that's required of work in a broken world, and it has to do with working for God. As the ancient teacher kind of looks at this whole perspective of working in this broken world, he comes to a conclusion. Look what he says in verse 24. A person can do nothing better than to eat and drink and find satisfaction in their own toil. This too, as I see, from the hand of God. For without him, who can eat or find enjoyment? To the person who pleases him, God gives wisdom, knowledge, and happiness. But to the sinner, he gives the task of gathering and storing up wealth to hand it over to the one who pleases God. This too is meaningless, a chasing after the wind. What's he telling us there? Just think about it. When you go to work, there's two people working side by side. One person thinks in their mind, I'm working for God. The other person, I don't know why I'm working here. I don't even like it here. They're both doing the same job. They're receiving the same kind of compensation. They're dealing with the same thorns, the same fools, the same stress. They're dealing with all the same. But one person over here says, you know what, I'm working for God. And what that tells me is God wins. God always wins. My efforts matter. Grace matters. He's given grace to me, so I can give grace to you. And I can give grace to myself because God gives us grace. There's a God in the world. There's faith that matters. There's another perspective. There's something else that keeps me going. So when one person is saying, why bother? My work is meaningless. I hate it here. There's no point. There's no purpose. And we all get to that place. Solomon was in that place. But in those moments, if we work for God, we can have this other truth that reminds us, wait a minute. God is working this thing. And in the end, he wins and his people win. They will get where they're going. This person here can despair, give up, and give in, but we don't give up and give in. Everything we do, every gracious act we give, it has a benefit. And what I found over the years, God encourages us in that. He reminds us that we're working for him. He does little things that tell us, hey, what you do matters. I had two of my junior high teachers come and visit me from Somerset, Pennsylvania this week. They just randomly appeared from Facebook or something. I don't know. They just came and found me. And they showed up on the island. We had a great conversation. You know what was shocking to me? They remembered me. Of course, I was thinner and had dark hair then, but they remembered me. They had an impact on my life, and I had an impact on their life. It reminds us that their efforts mattered. My efforts mattered. Even if nobody was paying attention, it's just a reminder. And also, as I was preparing this talk and thinking about that lesson I learned about good decisions and good conversations, I actually got an email from a young man at my last congregation who said, I remember one time you said something about working and giving it your best and taxes, or what was that again? And I was able to reply with this very thing that was in my mind. It was God's way of saying, see, somebody was taking notes. Somebody paid attention. It's still out there. God does that to us. It reminds us that our work really does matter, even if we don't feel appreciated, even if it is a broken world, even if sometimes we have to put up with the thorns and the fools. God is working through all that to accomplish His will. So what's the point? I think it's very simply this truth, that when we work for God, our efforts matter. When we work for God, our efforts matter. We may not feel like they matter. Nobody may recognize that they matter. We may not see a difference because of all the blood, sweat, and tears we pour into something. But everything we do, every good decision, every good conversation, God is working through that. Every sharing of grace, God is working through that to achieve His will. It gives us a whole other perspective of how to keep going. So where do we go with that truth? Next steps. I think we need to ask ourselves the question this week: how do we find new ways to work for God? How do we find new ways to work for God? Because when we work for God, it matters. It makes a difference. So how do we find new ways to work for God? And there could be all kinds of ways to do that. Share grace with one another. Forgive somebody. Maybe it's something small, like actually being nice to the waiter. Right? Acknowledge what they're doing. The single mom that's like working late. Show them how much you appreciate. Maybe it's someone you care about, someone you live with that maybe you're taking for granted. You just say, thank you. I appreciate that. Or maybe it's just taking level of service to another level. To realize there is a broken world, and even if we pair together as a team here at Rosa Church and I get more involved, we can make an impact not because of our greatness, but because of God's greatness working in us and through us. And as we do that together, God will win, and He will make a difference, and our efforts will matter because of Him. Let's pray. Father God, we thank You so much for this opportunity to engage in Your work. As we do the average, everyday work in this broken world with broken people and broken systems, may we continue to rely upon this truth that God is here, working among us, making a difference, changing people's lives, healing people through the grace that You pour into our lives and that we extend to one another. Use us to make a difference. And we ask this in Christ's name. Amen.